Watch almost any other mammal give birth, and it looks nothing like what happens in a human delivery room. A chimpanzee slips away from her group, delivers her infant largely alone, and is back with the troop within hours. A horse can produce a foal that stands and walks within 30 minutes of being born. For humans, birth is something else entirely, a genuinely dangerous physical ordeal that, for most of our species' history, ranked among the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age, one that still requires real physical assistance from other people in virtually every documented human culture. That's a strange thing for evolution to have produced. Natural selection's entire operating principle is reproductive success, passing genetic material successfully to the next generation. So why would the exact mechanism responsible for that reproduction turn out to be one of the more hazardous events in a person's life? For decades, the standard explanations seem to answer this cleanly. Increasingly, that explanation looks like it might be wrong, or at least badly incomplete, and the actual scientific debate happening right now is considerably more interesting than the tidy version most people have heard. Let's start with the story most people already know, because it's a genuinely useful place to begin, even if it turns out to be only part of the picture. Roughly 4 million years ago, our ancestors came down out of the trees and began walking permanently upright on 2 legs. Bipedalism was an extraordinary adaptation, freeing the hands to carry tools and food, reducing the amount of skin directly exposed to the punishing midday African sun, and allowing travel across long distances using a fraction of the energy a 4-legged ape needs to cover the same ground. But walking upright required a complete structural overhaul of the skeleton, and the pelvis bore most of that redesign. In 4-legged primates, the pelvis is long, flat, and open, creating a wide, straightforward birth canal. To support the weight of an upright torso balanced efficiently over 2 legs, the human pelvis had to become shorter, more compact, and bowl-shaped, pulling the hip joints in closer to the body's center of gravity. That redesign made walking remarkably efficient. It also narrowed the internal birth canal considerably, from a wide, straight passage into something closer to a twisting, constrained channel. For a long time, this narrower pelvis wasn't a serious problem, because our early ancestors still had comparatively small brains, roughly in the range of a modern chimpanzee's. Then, starting somewhere around 2 million years ago, something else happened. The human brain began expanding dramatically, eventually growing to roughly 3 times its earlier ancestral size. That expansion is very likely what made sophisticated tool use, complex cooperation, and eventually language possible. But it created a genuine anatomical collision. Brains needed larger skulls to grow inside. Pelvises were structurally locked into a narrow shape by the demands of efficient bipedal walking. Anthropologists, following a hypothesis first proposed by Sherwood Washburn in 1960, came to call this collision the obstetric dilemma, the idea that natural selection was caught in a genuine tug-of-war. A pelvis wide enough for an easy birth would undermine efficient walking, while a big enough fetal brain simply couldn't fit through a pelvis narrow enough for efficient walking. The proposed resolution was that humans evolved to give birth relatively early, before the fetal brain finished the bulk of its growth, which is why human infants are born so strikingly helpless. A newborn chimpanzee arrives with a brain already around 40% of its adult size, alert enough to cling to its mother's fur within hours. A human newborn arrives with a brain closer to a quarter of its eventual adult size, unable to lift its own head, entirely dependent on caregivers for basic survival. If a human infant stayed in the womb until its brain reached that same chimpanzee-level 40% benchmark, gestation would need to stretch to something like 21 months. And by that point, the argument goes, the infant's head would be too large to pass through the pelvis at all. This is the version of the story that's been taught in anthropology courses for decades, and it's genuinely compelling. It's also, according to a growing body of more recent research, not well supported by the actual evidence. And understanding why matters, because the honest scientific picture here is more interesting than the clean version. In 2012, anthropologist Holly Dunsworth, then at the University of Rhode Island, published research directly challenging the obstetric dilemma. Her team went looking for actual evidence that a wider female pelvis would meaningfully hurt walking efficiency, the central assumption the entire theory depends on. They didn't find it. Studies measuring how pelvis width actually affects human locomotion, including biomechanical work by her collaborator Anna Warrener, found the metabolic cost of wider hips to be far smaller than the classic theory assumed, nowhere near large enough to explain why evolution would have accepted the extreme danger of narrow pelvis childbirth as a trade-off. On top of that, when researchers compared human gestation length directly against other primates relative to body size, human pregnancy doesn't actually look unusually short at all. It falls right in line with what you'd predict for a mammal of our size and metabolic profile. Dunsworth and her colleagues proposed an alternative explanation instead, one they nicknamed the energetics of gestation and growth hypothesis, or EGG. Under this model, it isn't the width of the pelvis that determines when a baby is born. It's the mother's own metabolism. Sustaining a pregnancy is metabolically extremely expensive, and fetal energy demands increase sharply as pregnancy progresses. The EG hypothesis proposes that a mother's body has a genuine metabolic ceiling, generally estimated at somewhere around double her baseline resting metabolic rate, and that labor begins not because the fetal head is approaching some hard pelvic limit, but because the mother's body simply cannot sustainably supply any more energy to fetal growth beyond that point. As Dunsworth has put it plainly, human helplessness at birth isn't really evidence of an early eviction forced by a narrow pelvis. It's a sign of just how much additional brain growth still has to happen after birth, entirely independent of pelvis width. This isn't a settled argument, and it's worth being honest about that. The obstetric dilemma remains the more widely known and more frequently taught explanation, and some researchers continue actively searching for direct supporting evidence for it. Other researchers have proposed that both mechanisms, pelvic constraint and maternal metabolic limits, may be operating together rather than being mutually exclusive, and more recent papers have started using softer, more neutral language like the obstetric conundrum, deliberately signaling that the science genuinely isn't fully resolved. What's clear either way is that the simple, single-cause version of the story, brains got bigger, pelvises couldn't keep up, therefore early birth, is considerably shakier than it's traditionally been presented, and the real explanation for why human childbirth is so demanding likely involves genuine, still unresolved biological tension, whether that tension sits primarily in the birth canal, primarily in maternal metabolism, or, most plausibly, in some combination of both working simultaneously. Whatever the ultimate cause, the actual mechanics of a human birth remain genuinely unusual among primates, and this part of the story is well documented regardless of which underlying hypothesis turns out to be correct. In chimpanzees, the birth canal stays a consistent shape and orientation from entry to exit, wider than the infant's head throughout, allowing the newborn to emerge facing forward, which lets the mother reach down and guide her own baby out and up toward her chest without difficulty. The human birth canal is different in a genuinely strange way. It changes shape midway through, wide from side to side at the entrance, but wide from front to back at the exit. That shift forces a human baby through a sequence of physical rotations during descent, entering the pelvis facing sideways, turning roughly 90 degrees mid-passage to align with the canal's changing shape, and typically emerging facing away from the mother rather than toward her. Because the infant is oriented backward at the critical moment, a birthing mother generally cannot safely reach down and guide her own baby out without real risk of injuring the newborn's neck or spine. This specific anatomical quirk appears to be a major part of why humans are unusual among primates in relying on hands-on assistance from other people during birth, a pattern anthropologist Wenda Trevathan has studied extensively and termed obligate midwifery. Across the vast majority of documented human cultures, throughout recorded history and almost certainly for a considerable stretch of prehistory as well, women in labor have been assisted by other people, whether trained midwives, family members, or other members of their social group. Some researchers studying the evolution of human social behavior have argued that the physical necessity of this assistance may have directly shaped the development of human empathy, cooperation, and tight social bonding, meaning the sheer difficulty of birth itself may have helped drive some of the very social capacities that make human communities function. There's one more adaptation worth understanding, because it applies regardless of which explanation for early birth timing eventually wins out. Human infants are born with skull bones that haven't yet fused together, separated instead by soft, flexible connective tissue at gaps called fontanelles. During the intense pressure of labor, these unfused skull plates are able to shift and overlap slightly, temporarily compressing and reshaping the newborn's head into a more elongated, cone-like form, specifically to help it pass through the narrower sections of the birth canal, before gradually returning to a more rounded shape over the following days. It's a genuinely elegant structural workaround for a genuinely difficult physical problem, regardless of what's ultimately driving that difficulty in the first place. So why didn't evolution simply solve childbirth outright? The honest answer is that evolution doesn't really work by solving problems cleanly in the way that phrase implies. It works through trade-offs, and it optimizes for reproductive success across an entire species over immense stretches of time, not for the comfort or safety of any individual birth. Whether the dominant pressure shaping human childbirth turns out to be pelvic architecture, maternal metabolism, or some genuine combination of both, still working itself out in the scientific literature, the deeper picture holds either way. Difficult childbirth in humans isn't a design flaw evolution somehow overlooked. It's very plausibly the direct, unavoidable cost of two of our species' most defining traits: walking efficiently on two legs and carrying an exceptionally large, capable brain, arriving together in the same body at the exact same evolutionary moment, with no way to have both without paying a real price somewhere. We are, in a very real sense, still living inside that unresolved trade-off today, and remarkably, scientists are still actively working out exactly which part of it is actually true.